Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Classical Antiquity Sidequest, a podcast covering topics from classical antiquity. The period of time is known for, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Our next Sidequest will take us to the so-called Byzantine Empire, which, as we know, is just the Roman Empire. And as you listen to the next podcast, I want you to keep this quote in mind. Emperors were acutely aware that their subjects were all Romans. The world was no longer divided between Romans and their conquered slaves. As Julian reminded his cousin Constantius, no matter where they are born, all subjects of the empire partake of Rome's constitution, use its laws and customs, and by virtue of this are its citizens. Conversely, subjects were aware that ancient ethnicities had become irrelevant. In the early 5th century, a preacher asked, "Who now knows which nations in the Roman Empire were which, when all have become Romans, and all are called Romans?" That I just read to you is from a book titled The New Roman Empire, A History of Byzantium. It is written by Anthony Kaldellis. He is our next guest for this episode, and he is going to talk about why we use the term Byzantine, the problems associated with it, and how that term came to be, and really why it is that there's an attempt to take Romanness away from the eastern portion of the empire, and how really nonsensical such an activity is. While you will learn many things in this episode, one thing that you will learn is that the city of Rome itself was full of Greek speakers, and there is one person who was fluent in Greek, and it's going to surprise you. If you're a casual historian like I am of this period. It was interesting to learn and then confirm it when I read a book that I just finished up. It's a great story. I think you'll like it. I bring this up because we all know about how the Greek-speaking dividing line is used, and that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, I've already mentioned that Dr. Kaldellis is going to be our guide for this next side quest. The book that I mentioned came out in 2023. It is over 1,000 pages long, but it is worth the reading. It covers Rome from around the founding of Constantinople until the fall of that city and the fall of the empire in 1453 when the Ottomans conquered it. Dr. Kaldellis also hosts the podcast Byzantium and Friends, which is excellent, and I highly, highly recommend it to everyone. Now, a few things I want to apologize for in advance. You see, when I listen to Byzantium and Friends, I often will latch on or get my mind fixated on one topic or idea that's being discussed, and then I'll wander a little bit. I'm usually running or on a walk, and I start thinking through that in my head, and then I realize I've missed 10 minutes and have to rewind the podcast, whatever. That happened here, and so some of my questions were not as sharp as I really wanted them to be, so I apologize for that. I hope it turns out okay. Another thing that I wanted to not really apologize for, but bring up as I was editing this podcast, I got to thinking about how we label historical time periods. There's somewhat of a discussion that goes on between guest and host during this episode about that was really discussed more offline and fleshed out a little bit more, and I don't really get into it here. And as I've thought about it and as I've edited this, it occurred to me that I think Dr. Kaldellis and I were kind of approaching it from different disciplines and different approaches. I'm a trial attorney. I'll have cases with thousands of pages of documents, and I'll have cases with hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents. And regardless of the amount of paper and things that I have, when I get into court, I have to be able to summarize that down into bullet points or, a 30-minute opening statement or a 45-minute closing argument, or some way to briefly summarize all the key points to a jury, be it in cross-examination or whatever of a witness. And I think that has probably colored to some extent my approach to these kind of historical time periods like late antiquity, classical antiquity, whatever. I have to, in my mind, when I'm getting ready for work every day and I'm doing my job, put things into kind of chapter formats, if that makes sense. And I have to break things down into these periods so that I can explain them to somebody who hasn't really spent the time on the case that I have and isn't as familiar with the case as I have. Anyway, it's just something to think about as you hear he and I discuss late antiquity, what it means, whether it means anything, whether it's usable or not. It's it's just something that came to my mind as I was thinking about it. And also, I found this kind of thought process more interesting because when I was in college and I was studying the American Cold War era, American history and the American Cold War, I didn't really have to break it down and think about why we label periods the way we label them because it made so much sense for the time period I was studying. But anyway, just something to think about, something to keep in mind as that discussion goes on. I could go on for a long time about it, but I don't think it's pertinent here. So anyway, thank you for listening, and I really hope that you enjoy this next episode. It was a lot of fun for me. Anthony Kaldellis, how are you, sir?
I am well. Thank you for having me on your podcast, Ben.
Well, thank you for taking time on this Sunday to come on and discuss antiquity, Byzantium, misnomers, and all sorts of related topics. I'm looking forward to this. You host what is an excellent podcast, Byzantium and Friends. Can you tell us a little bit about how you started doing that podcast and how long you've been at it?
I've been at it for 5 years now, and I do take an extended break during the summer, and I'm coming to the end of one of those long breaks. I think I haven't posted an episode since mid-July, but I do need a break because I have to do my own work, and making podcasts, as you know, is a lot of work. I had been thinking about starting some kind of discussion about my field in a podcast medium for many years before I actually did so. Eventually, I did so, and I can no longer remember what the catalytic factors were for deciding to start in the fall of 2019. But I had this strong impression for a long time that my field was not taking advantage of all of the sort of media of communication by which people were learning and engaging with ideas and history, among other things, that we are kind of trapped in the media in which we are trained in grad school. Right. So my colleagues are trained to write articles and book chapters and books and give conference papers and academic lectures and teach to their students. But not anything remotely like this medium. Right? Which is why a number of them feel very, very nervous when you invite them on. They want to come on. They understand that this is a very good idea, but it makes them feel very nervous. And in part, that's because it's outside their training. But it does reach larger audiences than any monograph, any article, or any academic conference would. I mean, it just does. So I thought that the ideas and the latest developments in my field would benefit from being sort of broadcast more widely. I mean, as widely as interest in, Byzantine studies would get. So those were the I wanted to try a new medium, basically. I wanted just to play around with it and see how it goes.
It's interesting what you explained about hesitancy to take advantage of new mediums, which I can relate to being an attorney. But also, what I find interesting is this kind of discussion is something that people within your field do every day during the teaching calendar for the most part, right? And I find that they're naturally suited to these discussion points, and the interview-based podcasts I always find very, very interesting to go and listen to. Have you, as you've talked with a lot of people and had a lot of different guests, gotten any feedback like, oh, this wasn't as bad as I thought, or wow, this was a great thing to do?
Oh, they almost always think that, if not always. And some have done podcasts elsewhere or before, and I've had guests on sometimes a couple of times, and no, they all find it in retrospect to be a happy experience. After all, they get email afterwards from people who listen to it who would never have been exposed to their ideas. There's one other place where academics actually talk about their ideas in a more casual way, and that's like over dinner or at bars. Like I don't drink, I don't go to bars, but there are places where we talk shop and where we kind of let our hair down, or are more unguarded, like among friends, because without our apparatus of footnotes and hedging and qualifiers and all of that, academics feel a little naked. And this is what makes them so insecure. Like you go out on the podcast and you're expected to kind of generalize a little bit, and academics are terrified of that because they're always calling each other out about it. Right? Like that's the whole game of academic one-upmanship, is like, well, that's a generalization, and here I found an exception, or we need to qualify that, or blah, blah, blah. Like there's a lot of that. It's kind of pedantic, and we do it because we're academics. So when you go out into a podcast medium and you don't have your arsenal of, you know, footnotes and references and all the hedging language that we use when we write academic prose, it can feel a little exposed. You can feel a bit exposed.
I'm curious how your university treats your podcast. It is very different from a book. It's very different from publishing papers and that sort of thing. Is it something that's looked upon fondly? Is any attention paid to it? Is there any kind of thought in the academic community of, hey, we should invest as a group more in this form of communication?
With the last thing that you said, definitely. In other words, there is always a sense among academics and that about like outreach. How do we get the message, whatever the message is, out? How we reach broader audiences. That's always, elicits a certain amount of hand-wringing among academics who are thinking more about the social context of academic life, right? It's not, however, something that is institutionalized in any way. And because it's not a canonical medium, for example, it's not something I put on my annual reports. It's not something that counts as a professional activity, nor have I ever asked that it be counted that way. I don't want it to be folded into the bureaucracy of CVs and annual evaluations and things. Like the moment that happens, it might actually start to feel less pleasant for me to do it. I wanted it to be outside. So I don't expect anybody in the university administration, as it were, to treat this as academic work that I need to be recognized for. But sometimes colleagues will tell me, oh, I listened to that. It's very good. Thanks for doing it. I've had a dean who apparently listens to some episodes every once in a while and has told me that she enjoys it. And so that's great. Okay. So I think it's sort of understood that I'm doing something generally maybe important for the mission of the university, but it's not something that the university can institutionally see. Or at least I've not made the effort to help it see it, nor do I necessarily want to.
Well, let's switch from that to this podcast is supposedly about antiquity. And so having someone on from Byzantine studies may be antithetical to that to some extent. But I've gotten really interested of late in the concept of this idea of antiquity ending. And I guess the narrative going back to the AP European History course that I took in 12th grade in high school, the history narrative was kind of Western civilization tells us Rome falls in 476, antiquity ends, and we come into this horrendous dark age period. That was a while ago now. I think is probably about 25 years ago, somewhere around there for me.
Sure.
But that's not really an accurate portrayal of things, right? I mean, antiquity, whatever we think of as antiquity, the government structures, the religious concept, that still continues in the eastern provinces of the empire, right? It's not like a whole new system suddenly appears.
Yes. So because these terms like antiquity, the Middle Ages, whatever, these are very abstract and fuzzy terms. You can't pin them down to very specific things in such a way that you can then easily say, it ends here, right? So if you define antiquity with reference to a particular tax structure, a particular army structure, a particular type of intellectual activity, and then you say, well, this ends here, therefore antiquity ends here, therefore the Middle Ages begin here. But we don't. These are very broad and fuzzy terms. So we shouldn't be looking for very clear-cut, beginning and end points to any of them. Unless you're saying something like Islamic history, well, okay, or Christian history. Like that's a different kind of thing because that refers to some very specific events, individuals, texts, beliefs, and so forth. Let me correct what you started with, that Byzantium and antiquity might be antithetical. And you are correctly reflecting very widespread views when you say that. I'm not calling you out for being out of touch with how these terms are defined.
Right. And I don't agree with that assessment of late with the reading that I've done. But yeah, right. Please, this is part of why I wanted to have you on.
Right. So let me flip that exactly on its head and say that there is no antiquity without, at least on the Greek side, without what we call Byzantium. For many reasons, but here's one of them. The reason why classical antiquity exists as a thing for us at all is because of the survival of a corpus of literature, right? Without Homer, the tragedies, Plato, Demosthenes, the orators, Thucydides, etc., there is no Greek antiquity. There's just without those things, there would just be a period of history of mild interest for a few specialists. It would be something like, ancient Anatolian studies or Assyriology or whatever. I'm not putting those fields down, but they do not have the cultural presence of something like classical antiquity or Greek antiquity, right? The Greek classics. We have classics departments. We don't have Assyriology departments, they're folded in with other things. And we have classics departments everywhere, or almost everywhere, or we used to. But anyway, not only that, the origin of the modern Western European university is in the classics. Like when universities began, that's what they were, plus Roman law depending, plus theology depending on where you are. But that's what it is. When you studied disciplines, it meant you're an expert on those books by Aristotle, right? That's how our academic departments came about. It's which book of Aristotle do you study? So classics is like the matrix of this intellectual life in universities. It is pervasive in the culture, and that is because of those texts. And those texts survive solely because they were preserved in the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople by people who like to read them and comment on them and teach them. Had they not done that, we would not have those texts. We do not have Greek texts surviving outside of that channel of transmission. Right? Okay. We have a few on papyri. We might have been able to, pull a few fragments out of the papyri, some inscriptions. There's a long one that has some Epicurean philosophy on an inscription, things like that. But it would be nothing compared to what we have. We have those texts because the people we label Byzantines and assume to be, quote, antithetical to the classical tradition were actually the ones who kept it. And they didn't keep it for us. They didn't know about us. They kept it for themselves because this meant something to them. But instead, we've written this narrative where they and the classics are antithetical cultures, right? And so in Western tradition, the classics are like all freedom and science and reason and logic and light. And the Byzantines are all like, superstitious and intrigue and eunuchs and decline and fall and all of that. And never the two shall meet. When in fact, it's the exact opposite. We owe them everything. And not only do we owe them everything, they made choices about what text to keep and what text not to keep, and they made those choices based on their own priorities. Now, for some things like Homer and some of the tragedians and Plato and so forth, those, in a sense, choices that those authors are canonical and they're like super important and we need to keep them had already been made in antiquity. And so in a certain sense, you can say, okay, the quote, Byzantines are sort of following ancient priorities because they accepted them, they'd internalized them, they were established by that point, right? But for all the rest, if you look at a classical library, which got a lot more than just those authors, those are their choices. And they're meaningful, significant choices that they made for their own sake. So it's not antithetical in that sense. Just saying.
No, and I think I had started reading your book, The New Roman Empire, History of Byzantium, and I didn't get as far in it as I wanted to because we had a lot of power outages the last week before
Yes.
we conducted this interview. But you're really, I mean, if you, and I would suggest whoever's listening to this get a copy of it and read it. It's very good. It's obvious that the foundation for what we think of as this Byzantine Empire, this Eastern Empire, is really laid before that, and it's built on what we would consider traditional Roman concepts. So
Yeah.
in my mind, I'm trying to I'm having a hard time understanding why we separate those two and look at them differently. But you wrote an article about that I read about the importance of the Crimean War on the terminology. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So that's just one part of the story. The question that you asked is the important one. Why do we separate these things? And this is part of a long Western tradition of disparaging the Eastern Empire for political reasons. And there are lots of. I'm writing a separate study of the whole thing in its larger dimensions, right? But to make a long story short, as they emerged from what you call the Dark Ages, Western European societies began to appropriate elements of Eastern Roman culture, things like Roman law, which they accessed through the codification of Roman law made by Justinian in Constantinople in the 6th century. Right? So that, like, what counts as Roman law in subsequent European tradition is what a 6th century Eastern emperor in Constantinople and his scholars said it was, just flat out like that. They were accessing things like classical Greek learning after a certain point, all of which they got from the East in Constantinople. They had almost no local access to that in Western Europe. Forms and protocols and symbols and insignia of imperial rule. So how do you start to get like Western emperors, like in the Holy Roman Empire and things like that? Like, where are they getting their idea of what an emperor looks like? So a lot of those came from Constantinople. Not all of them, but a lot of them did. And so there's this process of appropriation that is almost never explicitly acknowledged. Instead, you have starting around the 8th century, a very persistent sort of drum roll of disparagement. And so the Easterners are considered they're labeled Greeks, not Romans, and Greeks in the Middle Ages means shifty, unreliable, treacherous, kind of sexually ambiguous, unmanly types. Anyway, and that continues for quite a while. You add religious polemic to it because the Church of Constantinople did not recognize the Pope as the supreme head of the church. And so that led to another layer of polemic and distrust and dislike. So what you're referring to in the Crimean War, this is a mid-19th century war between Britain and France on the one hand and Russia on the other. Britain and France sort of coming to the aid of the Ottoman Empire. Anyway, this is a complicated, messy situation. Okay. So the Crimean War is this turning point in what Western societies call the Eastern Empire. So until that point, they called it the Empire of the Greeks, following medieval practice. They rarely ever called it the Roman Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire. Sometimes it's a very, very minority, marginal view in the West to acknowledge it for what it was. They usually called it the Empire of the Greeks. And the reason why that term became problematic in the mid-19th century is because, in the 1820s, Greece had its revolution, independence from the Ottoman Empire. It established its own state. And in the Crimean War, Greece more or less sided with Russia. Sort of unofficially, but it did. Athens was occupied by French and British troops. And the Greek slogan for those Greeks who fought in the war was Greek Empire or death. Right? And that made the idea of a medieval empire of the Greeks kind of problematic for Western historians, because it seemed to be endorsing a kind of imperialism on the part of the modern Greek state, which was perceived to be allied with Russia, because at that time it was. And Russia was perceived as this kind of Orthodox despotism that wanted to retake Constantinople, which it often said it did, and reestablish the Greek Empire in place of the Ottoman Empire as a kind of proxy Orthodox state controlling the Balkans, but also the Bosporus and the passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So European powers are thoroughly alarmed, and their sort of scholarly wing drops Empire of the Greeks and gradually phases in this term Byzantium and the Byzantines, which is kind of nebulous and neutral and doesn't really mean anything, as a safer alternative than identifying this medieval tradition with a modern nation state, the Greeks. And that's how we got stuck with this term, Byzantine and Byzantium, which is just an archaic name for the city of Constantinople, right? It would be like calling people New Amsterdamians, or something, just instead of New York or Americans. It's just a kind of a weird archaism. It's buried deep in the antiquarian vocabulary that was used, even in the Middle Ages, but it's not an identity. And so then we got the field of Byzantine studies, and that's the one that we're currently occupying. And the history of these terms is all very problematic. We don't need them. We have actual, authentic, reliable terms from that time.
And what I've struggled with the more that I've read about this and listened to podcasts primarily about this is the idea that keeps coming up as well. The Romans in the East spoke Greek, and that's a difference that's substantive in some way in identity. And I have a hard time understanding why that would be substantive in any way, because there were all sorts of languages spoken in the empire, and we considered them Romans before the last Western emperor. So it's just hard for me to understand how that ever became some sort of important point in understand and viewing these two as different things.
Yeah, what you're seeing there are attempts to reverse engineer a justification for a practice that's pre-existing. In other words, when you're seeing those kinds of claims, we're dealing with scholars who are operating in a tradition that has already decided that these people are not Romans, or they're something else, they're Greek or they're Byzantines or whatever. And then you have to sort of counterintuitively find reasons to justify it. And so historians just come up with all kinds of, I have come across so many reasons to ostensibly justify why they're not who they said they were. One of them is this, the language, but which, as you know, is not a real reason, because ancient Romans, many of them also spoke Greek. Marcus Aurelius is a Roman Latin-speaking emperor from Rome, wrote his memoir, his meditations in Greek. Julius Caesar spoke Greek. He was in fact native in Greek. The moment when Julius Caesar is being assassinated, and what's his name, Casca or whoever, is stabbing him in the neck, Julius Caesar blurts out when he sees Brutus coming at him, well, we all know that phrase in Latin, but in fact he said it in Greek. This is explicitly stated in this. So Julius Caesar, at the moment when he's being assassinated, is not trying to perform like, oh, I know Greek and I'm going to say this in Greek. No, no, he's perfectly like comfortable in Greek because Roman culture had always been, always, you know, part of the broader Greek world, and it's anyway, whatever. I can go on and on and on about that particular criterion. Rome was one of the largest Greek-speaking cities in the empire. It always was. This is why St. Paul wrote to the Romans in Greek, because the Christian community in Rome was Greek-speaking, because Rome was a very large Greek-speaking city. Anyway, setting that aside, I've come across other reasons, such as, oh, Byzantium is not Roman, it's too small. Or it's not Roman because there are too many eunuchs at the court. I've even come across one that is like, well, the Byzantines are not interested in oral sex, and so they're not Roman. I'm not kidding. In a publication. And you realize, okay, you're just looking for things to say here. It's not like you're starting from the reasons. Anyway, they're pretty funny.
Well, that reminds me of some of the old legal opinions that you read that are very unsettling for gender and racial reasons. But also from the sports audience who also listens to this, think of this as a results-oriented decision, i.e., what the ACC officials did with Miami and taking away the Virginia Tech touchdown and the non-targeting call in the Cal Miami game. So that just think about that. Business decision, perhaps, is the right term. So
I have no idea what you just said, but I'm assuming it's on point.
Trust me, it is 100% on point. If you look up what happened to Duke in 2015 on Halloween night, Miami came to town, you'll see it. You'll just understand perfectly what business decision results oriented is all about. Anyway, let's play, though, a little bit of hypothetical, because one thing that I've gotten interested in of late is the concept of late antiquity. And part of the reason that I'm interested in that is because the empire maybe starts to change and kind of restructure itself, and it's different, but it also has me thinking it's very different from Rome as we know it when it started, but it's still Roman, right? And we have no problem with that. So it's just fun to think about in that context. But if we go back into what we may call late antiquity in the rubric now of 476 and just assume that the West keeps its emperor, right? And we just go on East-West emperor for a while, we wouldn't really be having this discussion at that point in time, would we? We would still view East and West as still part of the same Roman Empire. I mean, is it just that because the West no longer has its empire, that's what matters, or emperor, that's what matters to the Western Civ folks?
Yes. So to give the relevant background to your audience, in the 5th century, the western half of the Roman Empire collapses into pieces and essentially disappears. The eastern half does not. The eastern half continues on for another 1,000 years, and this is the Eastern Roman Empire, aka Byzantium. I think you're right that if the Western imperial tradition had continued, even down to that point, the two halves, as it were, of the empire, even though they had their own emperors, were still regarded as sort of the same state, the same society. You know, Romans here, Romans there. In the 5th century, you begin to get terminology such as East Romans, West Romans, which is just like a very broad kind of, Romans from each half could hold office in the other half. This was not a problem. Even the highest offices, consulships, praetorian prefects, this sort of thing, they were administratively divided into two halves, but not always two. In other words, even the distinction that we have between the Western half and the Eastern half, it wasn't always divided that way. Sometimes you would have three emperors, sometimes you would have one. Usually you had two as a matter of convenience. And they, evolved in somewhat different ways. So they weren't entirely in lockstep. The Western administrative and military structures were a little different. They're sort of more archaic into the 5th century. The Eastern half made some changes to its military structures. Certainly the churches the churches of Rome and Constantinople had very different ideas about who's supposed to be in charge and things like that. But those kinds of divisions they're not cosmic, end of story kinds of things. They're the sorts of things that always happen in any society and had been happening at Rome for a while. So unless you get post-Roman Western institutions like the papacy, like the German emperors in the Middle Ages, who want to claim the Roman legacy for themselves exclusively and deny it to Constantinople, you're never going to get this kind of bias with which we've been living all of this time. In other words, we're living within a framework that was defined by those medieval institutions, all of which are post-Roman Empire in the West, that we're trying to kind of reinvent or reimagine the Roman Empire under their leadership in different ways, like the Republic of St. Peter at Rome being a kind of authentic Romanness, or the German emperors claiming to be the, Imperator Romanorum or whatever. I mean, those are, unless you get those kinds of phenomena, there would have been none of this denialism that we get today.
So this is all just basically a fight over who gets to say they're Roman, and then maybe primacy over, I guess, if you're thinking about in a Western Civ context, who shaped the modern world the most, like who kind of a big brother, little brother type situation.
I don't know. The narrative about Western Civ keeps changing so much. We'd have to be more specific about, which version of it we mean. But generally the relationship, I think the Eastern Empire is seen in a more utilitarian way. In other words, what can we take from it while still othering it? If you were to, look, it kind of depends on how invested you are in the narrative of sort of Western Civ. Is this a thing? Because its genealogies are constructed in very strange ways. For example, you might have a genealogy of Western civilization, like from a textbook. I'm not like, reaching into some obscure corner of whatever, like a textbook, and it's got like Mesopotamia and Egypt, but like in antiquity, right? And then Greece, and then Rome, and then the Western Middle Ages. So the genealogy keeps moving from the past, toward the present, but it's also moving in this northwesterly direction. So it starts in the east and over time moves westward. It moves to Greece, it moves to Rome. So there's a point when, like, the ancient Near East is, quote, Western, but then it stops being Western for some reason. There's a point when Greece and Rome are Western, then they stop being Western, in part because, especially during the late Middle Ages, you had this flip from the Southern Europe to Northern Europe, right? And eventually it's the Northern European powers that have all the money and the resources and the empires and are writing all the histories and creating all the universities and hiring the professors who talk about how important Northern Europe is, right? And it's Berlin and Paris and London. And they're now looking down at Southern Europe, right? Like Naples and Athens is kind of backward, not just Mediterranean, which sounds nice, but like Southern Europe, which means like, the economic crisis, bank failures, and corruption, and so forth, right?
So that's travel to the States, it seems like, but we can stay away from that.
Yeah,
we don't have time for that.
Yeah. That's a different. Anyway, so the locus of being Western keeps sort of shifting. in these narratives? Is it so? Ancient Greece we want, but medieval and modern Greece we don't want. Ancient Rome we want, but it's not clear that we want medieval Rome, but we certainly don't want early modern Rome. Like that's icky. Anyway, it's a strange way of constructing a narrative. But the society that I study, so the Eastern Roman Empire, only little bits of it get caught up here, but they're pretty big bits. So for example, like Christianity, Christianity as it historically known in the West is an Eastern Roman creation in late antiquity. All of the basic texts are in Greek. The doctrines are all in Greek. The church councils were all in that part of the world. They're all like around Constantinople. So all of the beliefs that a Western Christian holds and the most important texts, they're in Greek. And so we want, quote, we want those. So we carve them out and kind of take them. We also want Roman law. So we carve that out and we take that too. And we also want all the ancient Greek classics. And so we'll say, well, okay, well, tip of the hat, those Byzantines kept those texts for us. Thank you, guys. I know you didn't read them very carefully. You didn't care for them. You just kept them somewhere for us. We'll take them now. Thank you very much. They belong to us. And so you keep taking things from their context, but not acknowledging that context as part of your story. This is where it's problematic. In other words, if you were to take all of those, these are Western societies, if you were to take all of those things, but acknowledge that society, which no longer exists, as part of your story, that's a different kind of narrative, but they don't acknowledge it as part of their story. And so it becomes very exploitative because the appropriation is mixed at all times with sort of these pejorative, disparaging, not just names and insults, but whole narratives about the Eastern Empire and it's decadent and all of that.
I do have a question for you as I've been reading your book, and we've been talking around this a fair amount. I think we know probably why we don't call the Byzantine Empire the Roman Empire. But now, is there any reason not to call it the Roman Empire, call it what it was?
No, there isn't. And in fact, I'm at least seeing a massive shift happening very quickly on this point. So if someone comes across this podcast episode in maybe even 2 or 3 years, they will be puzzled because they'll say, wait a minute, it's always referred to as sort of either the Roman Empire, the East Roman Empire, or its actual name, which was Romania. Because I think that there's a shift happening here very quickly, in part because prior practice, like 20th century practice, is just indefensible. And there comes a point in all of these disputes where you just can't, if you fall back on like, well, it's tradition, it's convention, which some of my colleagues are saying this, that's just an admission that you have no argument. Like that's the last line of defense when they say that. And I know that I'm reassured. I'm totally reassured because it means I didn't miss anything important. It's like, okay, no, I'm just stuck in my ways. That's all that means. And I'm like, okay, well, once you retire, then, game over. I mean, it's game over. So I'm seeing this shift happen very, very quickly. And, what I'm doing is part of this shift. I'm not solely responsible for it, though I gave it a big push, but, be that as it may, I didn't have to make anything up. So this is the interesting thing. So my arguments for these people as Romans, that not only did they call themselves Romans, but they were what they thought they were, is so pervasive in the sources that we have for their society, like what they left us, what they had to say about themselves, that it's like shooting fish in a barrel. It's like, it doesn't require particular sophistication to not respect what they say. It's rather like, are you seduced by your own sort of convoluted arguments about, well, they spoke Greek and like things like this. They're not persuasive. I don't think they're going to last for very long. Now, there's another problem, which is that in some European countries, academic positions are defined by law. Like the names of what you study and your expertise and your position is like part of a law that created the position that you hold. And so some colleagues in Europe, like in Greece and so on, they worry that if you yank the term Byzantine out of usage, suddenly they are left with a non-existent area of expertise in the face of the law. I'm, I'm
That would be
reminded
bad.
of I think this was a Sinclair quote. He says, "It's very hard to persuade a man to believe something when his job requires him not to."
Right. Right. Hmm. That the discussion about it and how just kind of fabricated the arguments for the term Byzantine Empire, or reminds me of sort of an offshoot of a legal argument that we have when I do primarily tort-based law, and when you have real clear negligence but kind of questionable damages or causation argument, we always say causation is the last refuge of scoundrels to describe the defense attorneys who really play that up. It kind of makes me think that tradition, and to some extent, is the last refuge of scoundrels here as we're going through this. Uh, one thing though that I would like to kind of go over with you, as this concept or this terminology gets replaced, how will that impact the classics fields? Because I've listened to some of the podcasts that you've been on where you've just talked about these terms are just kind of artificial and are a way for certain people in departments not to talk with other people in the departments about at the school about various fields. So how would that kind of, looking into the future, affect how we view these fields of study?
Well, I want closer contact and communication and exchange among all of these fields. And I think that these labels create barriers, especially because they're not neutral labels. They're not like just a period label. It's a label like Byzantine that has a very long and heavy kind of moral undertones. No, they're right on the surface. And they they scare classicists, for example, and so forth. Now, I don't think there are any practical difficulties here. Ancient Roman historians can easily get it in their head that the Roman Empire didn't fall in the 5th century. They've known this for a very long time. It's not something radical. If they have terminological problems, like if they say, "Wow, if we're calling things in the 11th and 12th century Roman, that's very confusing because I work on like BC centuries or whatever." It's like, yeah, at some point we can introduce, distinction labels like East Roman, and that makes it pretty clear. I mean, it's not difficult. We speak like when you speak of Greek studies in certain contexts, in many contexts, you have to clarify whether you mean ancient Greek or modern Greek. But when you're at a modern Greek studies conference, no one's confused about which one they mean, right? If you're publishing in the Journal of, Modern Greek Studies, no one is going to think, oh, well, I have to distinguish between modern and ancient Greeks. So you can distinguish between ancient and medieval Romans. You can distinguish between ancient and East Romans. I think the two overlap anyway. This is not a big problem. This is not going to create such confusion that heads need to explode. But people do have to set aside these deeply ingrained prejudices and thinking that, oh, this Byzantine I associate with bishops and theology and eunuchs and decline and fall and barbarians, and popes and Normans and all of that. And like in my mind, the category Roman doesn't include any of those things. Well, that's a problem with the category in your mind, because the Roman state did in fact survive into periods where you have popes and Normans. And if you don't like that, don't be a historian. But your job is to study history as it happened, not history only insofar as it corresponds to the categories that you have, right? In fact, you can flip this on its head, and some scholars do. And they say, well, like, why are we talking about the Roman Republic? Like, this thing changed. Even it wasn't around for like 5 centuries or so, and it changed a lot. We shouldn't be talking about it as one thing because the Roman Republic before Sulla is different from the Roman Republic under Sulla or after Sulla, or and so on. And you start slicing it, and it's like, yeah, those are major changes. The biggest change in the Roman tradition was the switch from republican mode of governance to the imperial monarchy. But no one seems to think that that invalidates everything after Augustus as Roman history.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you can study a lot about military dictatorships because that's essentially what it became for, I haven't even pieced out in my mind for how long, but certainly that was the modus operandi, it seemed like, there for a good while. Now, let's play, let's shoot a dart at the dartboard. If you were going to say when Rome ends, everybody's favorite argument, would it be when Constantinople was conquered by the Ottomans, or would you go out with some of the rump states? Where would you end that? And to really broaden it out, is that how far we should look at this vague concept of antiquity, or does that end earlier?
Oh, I see. Well, these are sort of different questions. So Rome continues to survive in the West. It's just not part of the ancient Roman order as we understand it. The ancient Roman order survives in the East, and I would take it down to 1453 or thereabouts. And what you call the rump states don't, I mean, they survive for another 8 years at most. I mean, so when we're talking a big picture, 1453 can stand as a collective term for 1460 and 1461 as well. However, this doesn't mean the end of the Roman people. They're conquered by the Ottomans and they continue to live under Ottoman rule, and they're called Romans both by themselves and by the Ottomans and by all of the other people around them, except for Western travelers. I mean, it's like the only exception. So, I mean, the history of the Romans is something else that lasts for another 5 centuries. I mean, in a certain sense, they're still around. The Rum community, though, it's how you understand it as a social legal group changes a lot after the 19th century. So it depends on what you mean by Rome. But
Yeah, I would
I
go
hope
with
I
the
gave it.
Roman state. Yeah.
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 Roman state is 15th century, for sure. And besides, what was going on then in medieval Western Rome was not the Roman state, certainly not. Yeah, after 600 there, it's very hard to make that case at all. So I'd say about 600 in the West, about 15th century in the East. But antiquity is a different matter. Antiquity is a much broader concept, much fuzzier than the Roman state. You can find the Roman state on a map usually, but antiquity, it really depends on what you mean. And like what makes antiquity different from post-antiquity, where whatever that was, so that's easier to say in Western Europe, right? So when you have the collapse of the imperial economy, basically, in the Roman state in the West, you're out of antiquity. Um, meh, there are some historians who would see that differently and who believe that late antiquity extends much further. But anyway, I'm just noting that there's a discussion there. But in the East, what is the dividing line exactly? Is it just Islam? When Islam comes along, it kind of changes the configuration of global geopolitics, right? Good. That you can take that as a kind of dividing point, but a lot of people don't. And they see late antiquity as extending into the early Islamic centuries. I'm saying this is a bit of a fuzzy concept. And personally, I don't think that late antiquity is is a thing. I don't think that it's a period so much. It's an approach. And this here we can get this can get pretty sort of theoretical and complicated, but
Well, no, I find that because I heard that in one of your other podcast interviews. It helps me from a rubric perspective where you start to see the state changing to some extent, and what maybe people thought. I'm trying to think of a way to phrase this, but more kind of the Augustan form of government and maybe some of these longer dynasties, and then the shift away from Italy itself as being so important. That's, as well as religious changes, that's kind of how I view that time period as the beginning kind of an evolutionary stage, like you saw with the Republic itself, where it went through kind of a small thing, larger thing, then, oh, well, this doesn't really work, and now we have this military dictatorship. That's kind of how I'm starting to operate it in my mind. So I view that more as kind of maybe the beginning of a transitional period to some extent, or an evolutionary period.
sure. And if that framework works for you, then use it and see where it runs up against its own limits, because it will at some point. But it's difficult to label any period of history a transitional moment, because in a certain sense, every period in history is a transitional moment, and every period can be described that. In other words, unless someone produces a robust and convincing argument that period X is not a period of transition, but is the period to which other periods transited, as it were, then I will accept the label as period of transition as meaningful. But unless someone does that, it's not meaningful because all periods of history are transitional. And calling them periods of transition is teleological. In other words, it frames this period as being what it is because of what came after. And that's problematic. Do you feel that you're living in a period of transition?
Oh,
Maybe.
yeah,
Yeah. Do you think your grandfather would have been right to think that he was living in a period of transition?
sure.
Yeah. Okay. So everybody does.
No, right, and I agree with that, but I think maybe the state itself is reorganizing itself in a way that will kind
Yes.
of set the tone for a time period. That doesn't mean that other periods aren't transitional, and I agree with you. Most
Yes.
periods are transitional, but it
You're
helps
right.
if you see kind of a pattern that maybe the term late antiquity is wrong. I don't know. Fortunately, I'm not in that field, so I don't have to get into these fights like you guys do.
Right.
But
Okay.
I think it's something that's laying the groundwork for, and again, you can do that for everywhere, probably to some extent, but it does seem to have some significance as far as that element goes.
Right. And I would agree with you. And sort of my book is kind of premised on that. In other words, it picks up when a, a, there were some administrative reforms, economic reforms, the foundation of Constantinople, like military reforms, like the way the Roman state operated changes in certain ways. I mean, incrementally, there's not like it's not revolutionary, but it does look by 300, it looks kind of different from the way it had been operating in 200. And it makes sort of sense if you're writing a state-focused history to take that as your guiding as your framework. But let me give you some background here in that what you described that so taking the state that and its operations as your framework is certainly one way of looking at history, and it's the way of looking at this period that is encapsulated by the label late Roman. So before there ever was a field of late antiquity, um, at least in the form in which we know it today, what you're describing, what I described, was late Roman because it focused on the state and its institutions and economy and so forth. Late antiquity, when it came along, especially in its Anglo-American versions, um, was very much a kind of either supplement or corrective to that, in that it was not looking at the state and its institutions. It was looking at other kinds of things like religious changes, religious identity, community formation, feelings, emotions, private life, women, saints, asceticism, the body, that kind of thing. And it was very much about either supplementing or just setting aside the state framework that many sort of traditional historians had operated with, or just assumed as a default, and looking at history in that way. And when you do that, and if the state is not that important, then it doesn't matter if you're bringing in materials from the Persian Empire, from the Caliphate afterwards. You can reach further back in time. You can reach further forward in time. Like, chronology becomes very vague and fluid, because if your framework is like religious identities and their quote discourse and the body, well, these things aren't period based. So I find it helpful in my mind to think of these bodies of scholarship as existing side by side, and one is more institutionally focused and state focused, and a lot of history continues to be written that way, and with good reason. And the other is focusing more on those other aspects, sort of softer, squishier aspects of private life and individuals and not the state. Though obviously you can never fully separate one from the other, but just a lot of scholarship does, because you got to write about something, not everything. And so that's how those two fields kind of coexist.
All right, to wrap this up, if you could give us a future podcast topic and a good book to read, aside from The New Roman Empire, A History of Byzantium, which I do recommend.
You mean my own books? Is that what you meant? Because
No. You can pick any book.
Any book at all?
Sure. We could read, what was Philip K. Dick's novel where he posited the Roman Empire continued? I can't remember now. I read about 50 of them all at once, it seemed like, but one of the Valis books.
Okay. So I read so many books that it's difficult to hold on. I will so over the summer I read Timothy Snyder's Black Earth, which is a history of the Holocaust. And I thought of that book. It's an excellent book. It's very well written and profound. And the reason I thought of it in connection with our discussion is because it does. I've read a lot about the Holocaust, and it's very rare that you come across something that makes an original argument that makes you stop and think, wait, what? And no, you're right. But I had never thought of that. And part of so the argument in the book, it says very many things, but that got my attention is that it pushes back against the idea that the Holocaust was, in a certain way, caused, in quotation marks, by the state, by rationalized bureaucracy that enabled this kind of industrial processing of mass death, which is a very, very common argument that you hear. That the modern state and its sort of development to the point where it can actually infrastructurally accomplish that kind of goal of mass death was like it gets put on the stand and accused. And the argument that Snyder makes there is, no, it's exactly the opposite. That bureaucracies were one of the very, very few things that could potentially protect the intended victims of that violence. And that what the Nazis had to do in every area where they wanted to perpetrate that violence was to eliminate the local state and create stateless people who had no identity and therefore no bureaucratic protections. Because they could not do, and this was fascinating to me, they simply could not do the same thing within Germany that they could do in occupied Poland, because they turned occupied Poland into a stateless realm, where the people there were just facts of history. They weren't legal persons. But they could not do the same in Germany, because Germany was a bureaucratic state. And when you try to make moves against your own citizens, suddenly the bureaucracy kicks in and there are delays and you can bribe people and, whatever. And it was just not that easy. The only protections that you have is if you have a passport and a state that will do something to protect it. I had never heard it. I'd never seen that argument. It was very interesting. Anyway.
Okay. And then the future podcast topic. Not promising I will make it happen, but I will try.
Oh, for your
Yes,
for
sir.
your audience? Well, I haven't looked at your sort of back catalog to see. um, well, why don't you tell me? I mean, what are you thinking of these days? And I'll try to pull a podcast topic out of it.
Well, actually, one thing that I have started thinking about, you can't see it on my shelf because of the background that I have, but I have some original source material or translations of it. I guess I should be more precise. I don't have old uh, collections that I stole from libraries of, but I have translations of primary sources, and I was thinking about trying to piece together episodes about, like I'd done one with Dr. Helen Lovett about the Aeneid and the role that trauma played on it. And I was thinking, or in the book, and I was thinking I could do more episodes on things like Herodotus's histories, Thucydides' histories of the Peloponnesian War, something on, for a while, the significant, or the, using the term significant is maybe a little misleading as I think about it, but what society deemed as important primary texts from antiquity and from that time period. That was part of my thought of maybe what I could do for some episodes in the future.
Okay, so as you were thinking, I pulled something out, though it's not from the words that you used. However, um, it's something that occurs a lot in the background to the Aeneid and also in Thucydides, and that would be civil war. Right? So civil wars in either antiquity or the Middle Ages, I've studied the Byzantine civil wars a lot. What are they good for? Like, civil wars get a very bad rap, but they can be also very productive in resolving certain kinds of tensions. I was actually just reading a book about the recurrence of civil wars in Chinese imperial history and why they happen. And yeah, anyway, it's a topic that ancient historians have perhaps not, paid that much sustained attention to, other than, treating them as instances of sort of social conflict, leads to civil war. In other words, the civil war is the exacerbation of a pre-existing problem. It is, but historically, that's not all they are. Civil wars also result in, after a long, bloody conflict, perhaps, but they result in usually a kind of a news stable consensus about power. And the fascinating thing is that it's never exactly, they never exactly land on like the victory of one side. It's usually a much more mixed kind of resolution at the end than what you would have expected if it's a one side won. By the time these wars are over, the sides have been reconfigured by the war itself in a different way. And the outcomes are almost always unpredictable. Anyway, I find them interesting in that regard.
I like that. That's a good topic, and there's a lot of civil wars that certainly could be covered, because Roman history, to a large extent, is a history of an ongoing civil war. So that's definitely something to to look at. And now I'm thinking a lot about Marius and Sulla and those civil wars. That would be a good place to start, and then could continue out from there. So
Yeah.
I will definitely look into that. Dr. Kaldellis, thank you so much for joining us and taking time to come on the podcast. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun. It was very informative, and I did enjoy the discussion that we had offline as well as on the podcast very much. You know where to find us, bullcitycoordinators.com. Send me an email, bullcitycoordinators@gmail.com. If you have any questions or comments or feedback about the podcast, please call and leave a voicemail, 540-632-0160. You can find me on the socials. I'm no longer on Twitter at Antiquity Pod. It is now at Antiquity Pod on Blue Sky. The other socials are at Duke FB Coverage. Go to our YouTube channel. Please check it out, like and subscribe. Still a bit away from being able to monetize this. I don't really care about that, but I wouldn't mind a couple extra pennies here and again. So stay tuned. We have some more episodes lined up. We are recording some now and lining up a few more guests. I think some good episodes upcoming that you will like. And I have to keep doing those because, as we know, the Classical Antiquity Sidequest is a podcast without end.